Yeah. Thank you very much. It's true that I cannot watch movies because when I watched Rambo, I felt so sorry for the poor Vietnamese veterans who came home traumatized and they don't find their place in the society. It was just like I couldn't sleep, and for days I was just like, what happened to those people? And actually, one of the last movie I watched was the day before we got married. It was Tom and Jerry, and I could even cry on that one. So that was just the poor cat, just like why can't he catch the mouse? I mean, like he never eats. Like, what does he eat? He starves to death. So
stay away from Bugs Bunny.
Yeah, well, okay. So yeah, that's a fun fact about me. So okay, hold on, I got to turn this on. Well, the topic we discussed in the morning. I mean, we've heard brilliant, wonderful, and deep-hearted devotions from Henry and Dave, and there's not much I could add to that unless some of the personal side of my motivation why I am involved in the mission. Well, this is the city that I'm from. We really miss that. It's a little bit different than Kansas City. This is our river walk. It's just not to intimidate anybody. I'm just saying that this is our river walk.
So good.
So
brilliant. No, you.
Well, we're married for 30 years. This is how I used to look. Well, look at the hair. Well, believe it or not, I used to have hair, and it was dark. And this is our family. Our daughter, Rahel, she's 26. Renato is 23 and 90. This is a 2 or 3 years old picture. This is, when did we take this picture?
This summer.
This summer. And that's our daughter's fiance, boyfriend, whatever. They're planning to get married next year, so we'll see that. And she's 6 months away to become a doctor, and he's graduating this year, and the youngest just started college. What's that? KU? University of Kansas.
What is
easy to
what is
that? What is that?
Rock chop.
Right. Yeah. So, I saw so many people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s losing their motivation. I've heard recently, I talked to a staff in another country. He said he's 45, 48. And he said, well, I'm on staff. I'm doing the ministry because really at this point there's not much I can do. Not anything else I could do. And it just provides a means of living for me. And that's just a tragic place to be. When you serve 20, 30 years and then you lose your motivation. Why am I involved? Why am I involved in this ministry? And as I looked back, I remember I've heard often, and you all heard often, Bill Bright saying that pray for me that I would not lose my first love. That was him saying that my motivation is the first love I have for Jesus. And when we talk about motivation, it's very personal and holy to us. Somehow, at least to me, it's connected to my first moment with Jesus. My first encounter. What was that significant about that? And it somehow it's born out of that. You know, it's intertwined with our personal story, with the people God brought into our lives, the paths, the difficulties, the brokenness of our life. Two things shaped my personal motivation, and probably is true for all of us. My conviction, my conviction is about truth and reality. This is deeply connected to my faith and to my theology. And the other is my experiences that I have lived through and found to be true. Now, the first is more on the intellectual, but it's not just intellectual. But the other is more on the emotional, experiential side of it. And there are things that motivate me that I have never experienced. I never experienced hell. Yet the reality of it motivates me. So you don't have to experience everything that is going to motivate you. But so it's a both thing. I mean, intellectual things and experiential things. So what I'm going to do, it's going to be a little bit subjective. Okay, I'm going to bring you into my personal story, because through that story, I can bring you into my motivation and why I am involved and why I'm so convinced that the mission that we pursue to take the gospel to the people, that's the only solution for the world. And so you're going to be part of a little bit of my journey, of course not everything, and what God did through that journey and shaped my motivation. There are three things why I'm involved. I'm just stating this, and we're going to just touch on these. The three things that motivates me is that only the gospel offers real healing and real life. The second is that only the gospel addresses the real problem. And the third is that only the gospel rescues from the ultimate danger. So that's, briefly stated, that's why I'm here. Okay, but there is a story behind every statement. So let me start with the first one. Dan Allender writes that God is not merely the creator of our life, He is also the author of our life. And he writes each person's life to reveal His divine story. In our story, God shows us what He's up to and what He wants us to be about. So, like it or not, we are born into other people's story. Our story is a sequel to the story of our ancestors. We are born into their dysfunctions, problems, sickness, and success. We're born into their trauma. The sins of our ancestors live marks in us, just as their virtue does. Of course, we are not determined to guide our story in the direction it was set before us. But we cannot ignore the impact that their story has on ours. We're all carrying trauma from the past history. My personal story is flowing out of our family story that is woven into the tragic history of our nation's past century. Fascism and communism left their deep and cruel marks, not just on Hungary as a nation, but on our family too. After the First World War, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territories and half of its population. Now just think about that for a moment. What would it mean for the US, just in one day, losing 2/3 of your territories and half of your population? And this is how it went. You go to work in the morning, and in the middle of the day, they cut in half the town, and you don't go home. And you never see your family. So that was the reality for half of the population. They couldn't see their relatives. They couldn't visit their friends. Their life was cut in half. So soon after that, the early 1930s, the tragic signs of the Jewish persecution started to show up. My mother's side of the family had been deeply impacted by that. Only two had survived the horror of the Holocaust. So their family lost everything. They lost all their family members, and we don't know their names, and we don't have a grave. They were burned. So World War II ended with the horror of the Soviet regime. My grandmother had been raped by 12 Russian soldiers, witnessed by my mother, who was a child at the time. Being a Jew at that time meant that my great-grandfather lost everything: houses, businesses, money, siblings, parents, job, and on top of that, her daughter being raped brutally, and then she became pregnant. So they aborted the baby when the baby was 5 months old. In the pregnancy. And then she had 17 other abortions after that, later. Then my mother had a lot of abortions. My great-grandfather was the survivor of this family, and all that happened to him, it's more than anyone can absorb. And these losses came with excruciating pain, probably, that he never talked about. So instead, the bottle became his painkiller and eventually his killer. After the Nazis were defeated, the Soviet army took control of the country. My father's side of the family, being a part of the nobility since the 1200s, were viewed as the enemy of the society. So at the end of the war, my great-uncle was taken to the Soviet gulags, to Siberia, which is the Soviet concentration camps. It was forced labor. He was there for 11 years. Very few people survived. And one day he just showed up at his wife's doorstep in 1956, and she was waiting for him, not knowing if he's alive or not. And the 1950s were very dark times of the newly established communist regime as it reached the peak of its brutality. My grandfather, grandmother, and my father had been deported, which meant, I had the deportation letter, which meant that they only could carry one suitcase for 3 of them. They had to give up their home, everything, and they were put in a forced labor camp, which is the communist form of slavery. And then they had to work there, controlled labor, forced labor. And my grandfather got a stroke and died. He was not used to physical labor. So the only descendant of the once wealthy Jewish family, my mother's side, and the only descendant of the once noble family, my father's side, fell in love and met in 1954. And this could never have happened because those classes were not talking to each other unless both were equally made poor and persecuted by the fascist and the communist. The 1956 revolution found my parents in their late teenage years. My mother's uncle had been shot by the communists a year earlier and had been buried in an unmarked grave. He was only 24. The communist was so kind that after they shot him, they sent to the mother, his mother, back the jacket that he was killed in with the bullet holes, just to remember that you don't raise children like that. During the revolution, all the boys in my mother's class was killed, every single one of them. So she graduated with no boys in the whole high school because the Russians killed every single one of them. So as a 19-year-old, when they graduated high school, they tried to escape the country. A 19-year-old soldier tried to help them. They got caught. They immediately shot the 19-year-old soldier on the spot. They put my parents to prison. Some family members were able to escape from the country. We never saw them again. So now the lasting mark of these regimes left its mark on my wife's family too. I'm not going to go into that story, but her grandparents buried two little babies, watching them starving to death because there was no food. So the pain caused by history was multiplied by the pain caused by the members of my family. Betrayal, cheating, alcoholism, sexual, physical, and verbal abuse, abortions, and occultism was present as an everyday practice on both sides of the family. So my story enters into the brokenness of this story. My parents already went through a divorce from each other before I was born. So they thought, well, let's try our life back together. And my mom became pregnant, and it was unplanned surprise. So they planned an abortion, but someone, a friend, talked my mom into keeping me. So I was born unwanted. This word prophetically shadowed my childhood. I do not have time to go into the details detailing the abusiveness of my father. That's another story. But he forced me to walk on my broken legs. I mean, there are terrible stories that he did. So I was 8 when they got divorced. And the next 5 years, I stayed with my father because that was the judge's decision. My sister stayed with my mom, and I stayed with my dad. I got really sick. The doctors told my mom that I'm going to be dead by the age of 18 or 20. Well, my mom decided to try to file a lawsuit and get me out of my father's home. And there was a year when I spent 200 days in the hospital because of my sickness. Finally, at age 13, I ran away from my father. 12, 13. And because he wanted to see me dead. He told me that. So it's a longer story. So I was completely destroyed by him and by the family background. And I had to appear before the judge because the police was chasing me because I was hiding, and that's a whole other story. But by the time I was rescued from my father, I was mentally destroyed, physically destroyed, intellectually destroyed. I stuttered. I hardly could speak. So at 8th grade, the teacher told my mom that this kid is so dumb that don't even try to send him to a high school. So he's not going to make it. So after that, I have not seen my father for 9 years. Even if I saw a picture of him, I got such an attack, an asthma and anxiety attack, that the ambulance had to come and take me to the hospital. So, how do you break the generational curse? How do you break out from that bondage of what your country put on you, of what history put on you, your family put on you? How do you function as a normal person? How do you move on? How do you forgive your father? How do you forgive your country? How do you forgive the Soviets? How do you forgive the Romanians, the Serbs? All those people that hurt my people. And I'm sure we hurt their people as well. I mean, it's not like, we both did horrible things to each other. So, and then, how do you not become hateful, resentful, a nationalist, a hopeless alcoholic? How do you break that cycle? On top of that, I collected more resentful and prejudice against Westerners. I hate to say this, but American and Western multinational companies came in since the 70s, and they took 1/3 of our GDP every single year, which means every third year we worked with the help of the communist leaders who tremendously benefited from that. They became the wealthiest of our nation, even today. So, and with their help, every third year, all of our GDP went to Western multinational companies. They took out 4 times as much money from our country as much they invested. So, you know, it's just like, okay, I was deeply wounded. So I had all the reasons to be resentful toward my father, to hate my country's leaders, to hate all the surrounding countries, and pretty much everybody. I remember one of our first encounter with Dave, and I told, I don't know if you remember this, but we were sitting in your car in front of Folyondar. You just moved to Hungary, and I told Dave that, you know, we said, well, let's work together on something. And I said, well, Dave, I mean, we can work together, but we cannot be friends. I cannot be friends with Americans. You know, also the Soviets, the Russians. I mean, no friends. People hurt me. I was done, completely done. So, you know, deep wounds don't heal fast. It takes time. So I started to pour out my heart to God in the secret darkness of my closet. And I will never forget the life-changing moment when the very first time I personally felt that the healing hands of God touched my soul. I opened the Bible. I was 14 years old, and probably one of the first time I opened the Bible. And it opened up. I would never recommend it to do for any new believer, but it just opened up at Isaiah 54. And I started to read that. Somehow, just the Lord led me to that. And it pierced me. This is what I read. It just, you will forget the shame of your youth. Wow. For a brief moment I deserted you, but with great compassion I will gather you. With everlasting love, I will have compassion on you. And those words were just, I felt like I was pierced, but not with a painful something, but with something that started to heal me. That there's a Father in heaven who loves me, who cares for me, who protects me, who provides for me, and want to heal me. So at age 14, as a new believer, I was so excited about my newly found faith that I, you know, just a young, you know, idiot, I denied to be a part of the Young Communist Party, which was required for every high school student. Starting high school, you had to be a part of it. So I remember the teacher told me that you cut your own throat, you're never going to go to university, all that. That's history. That person became later, after communism, a leader in the 17 minutes. In the post-communist country. So it took me 9 years before I was able to go back to my father, because I realized that I cannot live my life in this prison. And I started to understand the gospel and healed by the gospel, to a point where I said, I cannot live my life bittered as a victim, in resentment, in hate, in fear, because I cannot go back to my father. My mother was furious. Still to this day, she's asking, I mean, even this September, how could you go back to your father? And because I wanted to forgive him. And now he never thought that he needs forgiveness. But I needed the freedom to forgive him, because I experienced healing from the gospel, through the gospel, and real life, and I wanted him to experience that real life. You know, it's just like how miserable his life is, that he's living his life without any hope, but just an angry, hateful victim of the circumstances, always blaming others instead of a free person, a free child of God who regardless of where he was born and what the circumstances, he can be happy and joyful and live a full life. But he never experienced that, and he rejected that. But I wanted him. So every 3 or 4 weeks I called him. And I took my kids there because I wanted him to experience at least what it means to be a grandfather. Now, when he died 11 years ago, he excluded us from his last will. He did not want to pass anything to our children. So he died resentful. He died with this victim mentality, this hate toward people. And it's a terrible, terrible life. And I remember that a lot of people ask me that, why do you still meeting with your father? Because I felt I'm healed. I don't feel anything, against him that I anger or hurt. I felt sorrow for him and compassion for him. So that's what changed me. So I remember that how the Lord healed me in this. That 14 years ago, I recruited a Hungarian staff member. He's 10 years older than I am. And he was a part of the Communist Party. His father was high rank in the communist regime. He had all the privileges that we lost. He benefited from our suffering. And so because of people like him, we have lost everything. His gain was my loss. But somehow, this thought never crossed my mind. I introduced him to my supporters. I gave him leadership roles. We supported him, all that. And one day, it never crossed my mind until one day we were driving back from an outreach from Debrecen to Budapest. And he shared his story and I shared my story. And he looked at me and said, "How can you still talk to me?" And that's what I done. What? You're still looking at your old self. You're looking at yourself as Saul, who was persecuting the church. But you're now Paul. You have a new identity in Christ. You're healed and complete, and all that is forgotten and forgiven, and you and I are brothers. You're not a communist, and I'm oppressed by the communist. We're brothers. It's just like, but for him, it was still this old identity sneaking in to his life. So, that's my first motivation, and it's going to be really quick, the other two. Okay, so the number one thing that people need is not a healed system, but a healed heart. A healed heart. You cannot, regardless of how you change the system, if their heart is not healed, they're going to corrupt that system. And that's what motivates me. The real healing of the heart. I'm involved because we are focusing on getting the only message that can heal the people, and that's the gospel. Okay, the second one. Only the gospel addresses the real problem. Hosea 4 says that there is no faithfulness or steadfast love and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish and the sea are taken away. My people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. So, do you know why we have, environmental catastrophes? It's because of the lack of knowledge of God. That's what the passage says. The land languish, mourn, even the fish, the birds, everything suffers because there is no knowledge of God. That's the key problem. If we want to address global warming, if we want to address any issues in the society, we need to address the lack of knowledge of God, because the lack of knowledge of God, that's why there is swearing, murder, adultery, racism, everything. So the problem is the lack of knowledge. And addressing the systems without addressing the lack of knowledge is not going to solve anything. There will be no solution without that. Okay, the real problem is not in the system. The systems reveal the symptoms. The real problem is the sinful heart of the people. And as a nation, as individuals, and as communities, we turn away from God. You know, I remember that under communism, when I became a believer, I started to share the gospel with my classmates, and a lot of my friends turned into an anti-communist, underground movement. And I turned to the underground church. I remember that for 10 years, every Friday morning at 6 a.m. in the morning, I was up at the Gellert Hill with some of my friends, praying for the city, for the knowledge of God to saturate this country. I never prayed for communism to go away. I prayed for the knowledge of God because I knew that that's the only solution. If the knowledge of God will come, then communism is going to fall apart. Then the systems will change. And those people who focused, some of my friends who focused on changing the system, they were bitterly, bitterly disappointed. Because they brought another corrupt system without the change of the heart. And Fyodor Dostoevsky makes a very good point that if you haven't read Brother Karamazov, please do. It's a lengthy novel, but he argues with his age, in the 1800s, with the age of his revolutionists, saying that the whole novel, that's the topic, just to change and destroy the monarchy will not make people's life better. You need to change on people's heart. And boy, was he right. The new system was 100-fold more evil than the monarchy ever was. Because that's what we create. We bring out darkness from the heart. So I'm involved because the only solution we have the real solution to the real problem of the heart. This is what Bill Bright writes. The solution must begin where the problem begins, with the individual, not with the masses. Society cannot be changed until individuals are changed. And I'm not saying we do not need to speak up against injustices. We do. Everywhere we need to speak up against. Everywhere. But real change, without the knowledge of God, that's an illusion. It's not going to happen. We need to share the gospel and bring the real knowledge of God. And the last one is that the gospel rescues people from the ultimate danger. Now there's a thought that haunts me. This is the thought that haunts me. Every single one of my relatives, except my mother, is in hell. As far as I know, every single one of them. That's a haunting thought. They had a horrible life, a horrible, hard life, going through 2 world wars, fascism, Jewish persecution, communism, murder, cheating, all that, living that horrible life, and ending up in hell. That's terrible. That's terrible. That was not God's design. So I'm dumbfounded by how many Christians belittle the reality of hell. And they only focus on this earth. While we need to focus on this earth, I'm not saying that. But ultimately, the healing and the real solution and the real rescue is only going to come from the gospel. So, and we need, I'm motivated by this reality because I know the Bible teaches that. I mean, we've seen that yesterday in Dave's devotion, and how Jesus refers to that, how the New Testament teaches the reality of hell. But God loves, demands hell. Now, this is a contradictory thought. Let me explain this to you. Love cannot act coercively, only persuasively. He cannot ravish. He can only woo. Those who do not wish to love him must be allowed not to love him. Those who do not wish to be with him must be allowed separation. If you don't want to love me, my love demands that I let you not to love me. I let you choose. I let you be separated. God's justice insists on the reality of hell. Justice demands a reward and a punishment. The triumph of good over evil is not meaningful without separation. If you do not separate good from evil, then good is not meaningful. And evil is not meaningful. And finally, the cross presupposes it. Why the cross if there's no hell? No hell to shun, the cross is a sham. There is no significance to the cross if there is no eternal separation from God. Why did Jesus die? It was in vain. So these are the things that deeply motivate me. You can be healed to make complete, even from those resentful, hateful, prejudiced, bittered state that I was in. Hopeless. Full of hate, full of fear, rejecting every race, every country, my family, and my leaders. Everybody. And God can heal you, but only God can heal you. And He can make you whole. The second is that only the gospel is the real solution. And I'm not saying we don't need other solutions. We need to pair the gospel with other solutions. But other solutions without the gospel, it's just a band-aid. And not solving the real problem. And the third that motivates me is the reality of hell. I don't want more of my family members go to hell. I don't want that happen to any families. Because life is full of trauma anyway. We all have our own trauma. We all are hurt. But if someone said to me at a turning point where I had to deal with my father's issue, do I go back to him? He said, listen, bitterness is a poison you drink hoping your father is going to die. You kill yourself with that. But God can heal you. So here are some reflection questions. Okay, the next one. Have you allowed the gospel to heal you? Where are you not healed yet? Do you carry any resentment, self-pity, revenge, bitterness, or unforgiveness in your heart? What will you do to become free from these? If you have those, you're not free. The truth sets you free. Jesus sets you free. What would you change in your life if you would see nations, tribes, and people as God sees them, destroyed because of the lack of His knowledge and facing eternal punishment? So let's spend a couple of minutes focusing on these.